History Theory. Today, Friday, I'm going to end this week with one of the most requested videos as of recently. Now, I don't know if it's because it's popular out there, or if there's a new series. I really don't know if that's why it's so popular, but a popular request. I didn't check on Netflix or anywhere else, so I decided I've been reading this book about true crime cases. Can't remember the author, but I'll put it down below. And he covered all the bases of this case, and I thought that at least I will try to share it in a way that it will make sense. It is going to take us all the way back to the 1970s, and in the Pacific Northwest, where I live. But at the time, it was described as a very dangerous place for a teenage girl. It seemed that every month there was a new young girl missing, and it was terrifying for everyone, really. Let me share from the beginning. In January of 1970, 17-year-old Patricia Garrison was murdered as she drove home from her job at Sea First Bank in Olympia, Washington. The killer was very creepy. I mean, he cut her skull 20 times with a knife and then stabbed her 3 times in the chest, once in the back of her shoulder, and then 8 more times on her arms and legs. But then he decided to dump her in front of St. Peter's Hospital, where she really clung to life for 32 hours before dying. 8 months later, 3 children were playing in a remote wooded area just north of Olympia when they discovered a human skull. They didn't say anything at first, but then eventually they told somebody and reported to the authorities. Near where they found the skull, Thurston County deputies found a shallow grave that had been scavenged by animals. They found bones, a piece of scalp with long dark blonde hair, a pair of blue jeans, white sneakers, and a polka dot swimsuit. Neighboring Pierce County officials, they suspected that this was the body of a missing 13-year-old. Her name was Laura Lee Burbank. She had been on her way to a pet shop when she disappeared 2 months earlier. They suspected this employee of the pet shop, David Fisher, who basically had promised her to show her some baby raccoons. He was kind of a creep, and he had an eye for young girls. And his wife had found a pair of young girls' underwear So they arrested this guy, and he was later convicted and sentenced. But just a few months later, another young Olympia girl, 15-year-old Valerie Good, was shot to death by a stranger in her own home. Over the next several years, more and more girls disappeared, but were found later on butchered, including 19-year-old Debbie Potter, who was killed while leaving her job as a waitress at the China Clipper restaurant. That one was never solved, and several more in the Olympia area, like Linda Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, and Roberta Parks, just to name a few. But later on, they would confirm to be the victims of the notorious Ted Bundy. Though she was only 14 years old, Kathy Devine was struggling with the reality of becoming a young adult. She had a fight with her boyfriend and naively assumed that the end of the relationship was also the end of the world. She had a few cousins that lived in Oregon, in Portland to be more exact, and kind of near Olympia. So she decided to run away from home. Her plan was to hitchhike from her home on Aurora Avenue North, Seattle, and make her way down to Oregon to stay with her cousins for a while. On November 25th, 1973, Kathy packed a small bag and left her mother a note, ending with, "P.S. Don't worry, Mom, I'll be back." Her mother, of course, reported her missing to the Seattle police, who immediately started to look for her. The police inform her that young girls usually come home on their own after a few days. So even though they were looking, they were not 100% invested in this investigation. Less than 2 weeks later, a young couple were cleaning the campground at Camp Margaret McKinney. This is just south of Olympia, Washington. And at the edge of a clearing, they found the partially clad body of a young girl. Her clothes had been cut with a knife, and when police saw and found actually the body was face down in the rain. She had been strangled, sodomized, her throat was slit, and it was disturbed by animals. Her decomposition kind of threw the idea that she'd been there for at least a week. There wasn't much blood at the scene, so she was probably just dumped there and killed somewhere else. There was no wallet or purse, so they couldn't identify who she was. On her body, they found a sweat coat with a fake fur trim, a white blouse that had been cut open, and dark blue denim jeans that had been cut up the backside. The jeans had a dragon patch on the left rear pocket. She was wearing one brown waffle stumper boot, but the other boot was missing. On her ears were a pair of gold cross earrings was a very remote area. It was about 5 miles from I-5 and about 15 miles south of downtown Olympia, in a rarely used road full of fir trees and a pine forest. The police assumed that the killer must have known the area. This was not a place that she would just wander into. So the police showed the items of clothing in the news. Kathy's older sister Sherry recognized the dragon patch right away. Dental records confirmed that the dead girl was Kathy Devine. Thurston County detectives worked together with the Seattle police, and they were trying to put a timeline since the time that she left Seattle. One of Kathy's friends told police they saw her getting into a truck in Seattle near her home. Other friends said that they saw her with a boyfriend a few days after she went missing. So they needed to talk to the ex-boyfriend. Seattle police spoke to the parents of Kathy's ex-boyfriend, and his parents allowed them to interview the boy since he was a minor. He confirmed that they had broken up on November 25th, but that was the last time he talked to her. They searched the home, and he took a polygraph and passed. He was soon enough cleared. When the news of Kathy's death was released to the public, tapes came in from all over the state. One of them, a neighbor of the Devine family, claimed that he had witnessed Kathy's murder. But when the police asked him for details, he remained silent. So they got a search warrant, and they searched his home. At the house, they found newspaper clippings about the murder. They found the knife covered in blood, which was about the same size as the one used on the body. The blood, however, proved to be animal blood, and the man ended up being cleared as a suspect. He was basically just a weirdo. Another tip, unfortunately, went unnoticed. Police received a call from someone that worked as a restover truck stop south of Olympia. The man said that he had suspected a co-worker was stealing from him and looked in the back of his pickup truck. There he found a tarp, and when he lifted up, he saw a sleeping bag covered with blood, as well as a small single waffle stomper boot, like the one that Kathy was wearing. The following day, the truck was completely and mysteriously burned in a fire. Sadly, this tip is the most believable one and the most probable, but it was never followed up at the time. So the police had the clothes she was wearing, the DNA that remained from a swab. But unfortunately, in the year 1970, the use of DNA as a crime-solving tool was really not available. So it turned into months of investigating, then years this was happening, other young girls were still dying in the Olympia, Washington area. In the years that followed, the world became aware of one of the most notorious serial killers in history, Ted Bundy. By 1975, the sociopath had kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered numerous young women in the same area that Kathy was killed. Bundy's prey were almost always a certain type of girl. Young, long, straight hair parted in the middle. And Kathy really fit the description. But then Ted was arrested and convicted. And he confessed to 30 murders, many of which happened in that same Olympia area. So they believe that Kathy was one of his victims. With days before he was to be electrocuted, Thurston County detectives visited Ted Bundy in prison. He had nothing to lose, so they hoped that he might confess to the murder of Kathy Devine and put an end to the mystery. But he said he didn't do it. Though many still believe that Bundy did it, detectives knew better. And really, the murder didn't fit his style. Ted Bundy, he often beheaded his victims, but Kathy was not beheaded. She was also last seen getting into a truck, and Bundy usually drove a Volkswagen Bug, and he used something to make himself seem helpless. Kathy's family spent the next 29 years after her death believing that Ted Bundy had killed their daughter and had gone to his grave with the secret. But in the year 2002, there had been a massive advance in crime fighting with the use of DNA. In the year 1998, the FBI developed the Combined DNA Index System and made it available nationwide. So the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab was tasked with going through cold cases from the 70s, including Kathy's case. They had the DNA saved from the crime scene 29 years prior, so they ran it through the system and they had a hit. William Earl Costin Jr. In 1966, 19-year-old William Costin Jr. had just returned from an 11-month tour in Vietnam to live with his parents in St. Mary's County, Maryland. He was injured during combat and given medical discharge as a highly decorated Marine. But he was actually a killer. Months after his arrival back in the States, he attended a dance in the tiny town of Leonardtown, Maryland. He had his eye on a certain girl, 22-year-old Helen Patricia Pilkerton. At the end of the evening, Helen made the biggest mistake of her life and accepted a ride home from him. The following morning, 2 teenage girls found the lifeless body of Helen in a nearby creek. She had been badly beaten, stabbed, and raped with a pool cue. He was quickly arrested for the crime, and Friends argue that his traumatic experiences caused him to develop homicidal tendencies. And because of this tendencies, I mean, he was behaving that way, basically, that's what they were saying. Their plan was to plead insanity. So, in this court document, I'm gonna read a little few sentences from it. Quote, he participated in the killing of over 200 of the enemy in a single operation, in which he distinguished himself as a fighter. Military doctor noted that he suffered from an uncontrollable urge to shoot his fellow Marines. Despite attempting to choke another patient, he had been released from the military hospital in Philadelphia to return to Maryland and murder Helen. The defense proved that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was acquitted for this murder charge. He was sent to this mental hospital for the criminally insane, but he only spent there 3 years, and they believe he recovered. After his release in early 1973, he and his parents moved to Washington State, where his father purchased the rest of a truck stop just south of Olympia on Interstate 5. He worked for his father at the truck stop, the perfect location to prey on young girls. So not long after moving to Washington State, he murdered Kathy Devine. It's believed that she had hitchhiked from Seattle down Interstate 5 to Little Rock, Maytown exit, where she crossed paths with this guy working at his father's truck stop. After Kathy's body was found, he went completely undetected for 2 more years, until November 30th, 1975, when 24-year-old Beverly Pearson was on her way home from work in Olympia, Washington, and stopped to get gas. She stopped at his dad's truck stop and was familiar with the family. That night was cold and snowy. Once cars left the main interstate, the roads were extremely icy. So he offered to follow Beverly home that night in his truck to make sure she made it home safely. But she refused. She didn't live far and knew the icy roads well. So she left the truck stop and continued her drive home. Beverly noticed the sky headlights behind her. He had followed her anyway, even though she clearly stated she didn't want his help. His headlights swerved off the road and his truck slid off into the ditch. So Beverly stopped her truck and slowly reversed to see if he needed help now. He asked her to get behind his wheel, the wheel of his truck, and tried to drive it out of the ditch while he pushed. Then he struck her over the head with a large rubber mallet, pushed her into his truck, and drove off. She begged for her life. She told him that she knew him and she knew his family, trying to communicate with him and kind of connect with him on a personal level. He pulled onto an old logging road, stopped the truck, raped her twice. She begged for her life, and he eventually drove her back to her truck, sparing her life. Beverly was the stepdaughter of a police detective. As soon as she got home, she called the police and reported the sexual assault. For the rape, 29-year-old Costin was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 48 years in prison and was to receive extensive psychiatric treatment. He sat in prison for 26 years before the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab linked him to Kathy's murder. When they confronted him with the evidence, he admitted that he had sex with Kathy, but claimed it was consensual and that he didn't kill her. But during the murder trial, jurors weren't allowed to hear about his past rape conviction or his prior murder trial, an insanity plea. Despite this disadvantage for the prosecution, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. On June 23rd, 2015, William Earl Costin Jr. died of a sudden heart attack while in prison. If only the police would have taken seriously the tip about the guy working at the truck stop who said that he saw the boot that matched Kathy's boot, this would have been solved a long time ago. It is sad to see that people kind of get put into one bag and, oh no, this is part of the of Bundy's victims, or this is part of this, or this is part of that, and that the police is so overworked and so overwhelmed that sometimes they don't have the time to go back to every single tip that would help them get closer to the killer. Such a creep. Sleeping in his dad's basement. Working at his truck stop. And really preying on the weak. And I'm not saying because they were girls or they were underage, but I'm just saying that he knew what he was doing. And to who he was doing it to. I have to say that because of the kind of work that I do, I go to rest stops and truck stops, gas station kind of thing, very regularly. I get coffee there. I use their restrooms. Sometimes I even have breakfast there, almost, 2 or 3 times a week. And they're only, and I'm talking about I-5, the same highway that goes through Washington, goes down to Oregon, and then goes down to California, and, kind of, you can find it in the border with Canada or even Mexico. So, same highway. And there are some truck stops that I go, and I'm like, okay, this, my favorite one, that's the one that I stop, There's some other truck stops that seem like one of those episodes from Supernatural where there's a vampire lost in the parking lot or is wondering, or, something creepy is wondering where the truck stop for the night or whatever. And, they give me the wrong vibes, and I'm like, okay, I stopped once here, I tried it, not worth it, not stopping here again. it's not because I'm a woman or that, I'm by myself or whatever, but you get different vibes. Now, this guy, I don't know how charming he was back in the 70s. I don't know the whole vibe of his dad's truck stop, but if you live in the area, you know the family, you know the people, you assume, for whatever reason, that you're safe. But this proves once again that you never know. You may think you know, but you never know. So another creepy story for my twisted head when I stop at a truck stop. I don't know where my favorite truck stop is. It's somewhere along I-5. And the creepiest one is also along I-5. I don't know if you get the vibe of good and bad after years of being on the road, or, if it comes with age and experience, but I can totally see somebody younger not caring and just going into these places and meeting the wrong person. Because most truck drivers are just doing their job, getting things done, and not looking for this. But then there are some other psychos out there who really are. Please share your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for being